Basil is kind of one of those plants in my garden where I want it around. I want lots of it. We eat a lot of pesto. I like to put it on my pizza and my pasta and all that good stuff. But honestly, I don't care that deeply about this plant. I'm sorry to say I am not really a basil expert. I just want it to grow and grow healthy so that I have enough of it whenever I want it and kind of not have to put a whole lot of thought into it. This isn't a tomato for me. It isn't a cucumber. I'm not going to spend hours of my time researching basil varieties. That's just how I am about it. So I thought today maybe I would talk a little bit about my lazy gardeners or hands-off approach to growing a basil patch. I've learned there are about 5 things that I really need to do to make sure that this plant grows healthy and big and strong and tasty and all that stuff so that we have plenty of it. And everything else I can kind of just not worry about it, not sweat the small stuff like I would with most of my other garden veggies. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about 5 things that you should probably know in order to grow a big, healthy basil patch, and maybe 4 or 5 more things where you probably just don't need to worry about it. Tip number 1, and by far the most important thing I have learned for growing a lot of basil without a lot of effort, is to plant densely, like super, super densely, y'all. I think I have 18 plants in here at last count. It changes a little bit day by day or week by week, and that has really, really, really upped my game without having to put in any extra effort into the space. So one study found that you can actually maximize your basil output, at least in sort of that warm summer, fall, shoulder season, which is kind of right where we're getting into right now, by planting 40 basil plants for every 1 square meter, which is really, really quite dense. I think a fair bit denser than most of us are going to plant, at least our first time around. More typical basil guidelines are going to call for 1 plant every, I don't know, 4 to 8 inches or so, and I definitely err on more like that 4 inches side or even less. We've really got our plants packed in here. As you can see, there's lots of little ones coming up that will kind of replace any of the ones that I need to take out as pests get to them or as they get a little bit older or whatever. So yeah, we've got lots in here and we can kind of just keep going and going and going. When I prune any of these smaller ones that are currently getting shaded out, they're gonna have more than enough sunlight to grow big and strong themselves. Tip number 2 is going to be to water the heck out of your basil plants, particularly if you live in a really warm climate like I do. I found that basil kinda is a water hog. Just as a point of reference, I planted my basil plant in here with some bush beans. I'll show you those here in a second. And what I found is the basil really thrived with a level of water that was actually damaging the bush beans even, and bush beans are pretty tolerant to a lot of different conditions. I was getting some fungal issues, I was getting some dampening off on the young bean seedlings, and if I was watering less, then I was finding that the basil was kind of drying out. So I was sort of surprised to find that basil kind of falls into that category for me of a plant that requires a little bit of extra water relative to maybe the standard, like say something like a cucumber. What I've actually done here is we've used a lot of our native clay soil. So this is really, really, really bad soil, and the basil's actually doing pretty darn nice. And that native clay soil retains a ton of water, too much water, really problematic amounts of water. But yeah, overall the basil seems to do very well in it so long as it's getting enough nutrients and air. So yeah, that's tip number 2. Water a little bit extra. That seems to be beneficial for my basil patch. As you can see here, or maybe you can't see, you know what, screw it, let's just pull one of these out. All right, so this is one of my basil plants that's kind of in the back of the container directly underneath this big almond tree. And you can tell my plants are, you know, a little bit leggy, and that is intentional. I basically made the decision that I'm going to err on the side of too little sun. Basically what I've found is that in my very hot, very sunny summer climate, and this changes a little bit depending on the time of year, but at least during the main summer growing season, my basil plants do better if I'm basically putting them in a shade patch. I don't even really think this area qualifies as partial sun. It probably gets more between 4 to 6 hours of sun, and a lot of that is a relatively weaker evening sun as the sun kind of passes behind some big ash trees. And actually they're doing so much better. Take a look at these 2 basil plants that we have in our front yard main garden area, a spot where tomatoes and eggplants and some of the more drought tolerant herbs are doing really, really well. Man, these plants are in much better soil than the ones that I was showing you in our backyard. They've got more nutrients. They've got their own dedicated drip line emitter. They're getting plenty of water. They were getting a lot more attention, right? This is my main garden. And oh my goodness, the leaves are tiny. They are super sunburnt. They are less tasty. Overall, really not very healthy plants, and you can see that I just let them go to bolt. I'm just keeping them around because the bees seem to like them at this point. So yeah, the tip here is if you live in a very hot climate and you are struggling with basil, I would say go ahead and experiment with giving them maybe less sun than you think is possible or advisable. I know basil is typically thought of as a full sun plant, and that probably is true in a lot of climates, but for us at least, erring on the side of too little sun was definitely a lot better than erring on the side of full sun or too much sun. There are so many really cool varieties of basil, and I don't want to downplay that with this next tip. I know how fun it can be to experiment with different varieties. I've probably grown 15, maybe more like 20 different varieties of tomatoes in the last year or so, and that was an absolutely unnecessary degree of variation, but I do it because I'm really interested in that. I really find it fun to experiment with and research those varieties. But with basil, if you are kind of not that passionate about the different varieties and you just want to get plenty for eating, I really have to recommend a large leaf variety like this, large leaf Italian basil. Sometimes it's called sweet Italian basil. This is considered a pesto variety. And what I have found relative to some of the other basil varieties that I've tried, like Thai basil or cinnamon basil or Genovese basil, is that the plant grows bigger. It grows faster. It's a little bit sweeter. This is a really nice basil, both for putting on top of things like pizza and making pesto from, obviously. And it's relatively hardy. It's just a really good variety for sticking into the ground, not worrying about, and getting plenty of foliage off of. So that is going to be tip number 4. Go ahead and just try out a variety or a seed packet of Italian large leaf or Italian sweet basil. I've really kind of settled on this one, and it works really well for us. For what it's worth, I buy my Italian large leaf basil here for $1 per seed packet from dollarseeds.com. I'm not in any way associated with them, but at that price point, I can afford to really just kind of not think about the seeds and sow as many as I want, either directly or transplanting. Get into that in a second. And we always have plenty of this really nice tasting large leaf basil. Okay, tip number 5, last one of the day, is going to be to experiment with succession cropping and transplanting rather than relying purely on direct sowing. For me, I've really found that my basil plants are a little bit hardier, a little bit stronger when I transplant them in rather than direct sowing. And this patch here is actually a little bit of a mix of both, just because sometimes I get lazy and just want to toss some seeds in there. But I found that these transplanted plants really do quite a bit better. And the germination rate, particularly in the really hot summer months, is much better if I'm starting them in those protected seedling containers and then transplanting them in. They germinate pretty quickly, they grow pretty quickly. It's not like I need to spend a ton of time, maybe a week before I want to transplant it in, getting those seedlings ready to go. It's not a tomato that you're having to start months and months ahead of time. And then to add on to that, I am not too precious about removing a plant if it is getting kind of gnarly and I want to make some room for a healthier one. So most of these look pretty good, but actually this one right here in the front has taken a little bit of damage either from pests or honestly more likely my dog. For whatever reason, my dog likes to come over to this patch and kind of munch on things. He freaking loves dill, but basil seems to be interesting enough. So yeah, I will just go ahead and remove this one. Obviously this is a little bit leggy anyways. It's a little bit beat up. Still smells absolutely amazing. And so what that's gonna do is basically let this smaller plant right beneath the one that I just yanked out get a little bit of extra sunlight and hopefully take its place. I've really already got a replacement ready to go in here. This one looks pretty good. I'm sure that it will take over the spot just fine now that it is getting some extra sun and a little bit more nutrients and isn't crowded out by that other plant. We've got some basil to eat tonight, I guess. Now, some folks will actually do that kind of pull and replace strategy or schedule very methodically and intentionally because they prefer the taste of the leaves off younger basil plants. That is not strictly necessary, and I don't know that I personally have noticed a big difference in the taste of leaves between a more mature plant and a younger one, but that succession crop style of gardening where you're pulling one and you're replacing it and you're just constantly bringing in new plants and you go through quite a few in a single season, that strategy can work well with basil. It grows quite quickly and it tends to bounce back from having a slow start pretty well. Okay, to wrap up, y'all, if you are also interested in just growing a patch of basil and not thinking about it too much and kind of taking a lazy gardener's approach to supplying yourself with plenty of pesto ingredients, here is what I would recommend. First off, grow a variety like Italian large leaf basil or sweet Italian basil. Grows really, really nicely. It's strong. It's relatively disease resistant. It's a good sort of plant to default to. 2, err on the side of less sun rather than too much sun, or at least experiment with your planting. I personally have found it is much, much better to have slightly leggy plants with nice, big, healthy leaves versus bigger, sort of stockier plants with really small, scorched, sunburned leaves. 3, try giving it a little bit extra water relative to maybe what your standard veggie garden requires. I have found that these plants are just very slightly water hogs in that regard. 4, don't be afraid to rip out old plants. I've found that transplanting in and doing a little bit of succession cropping really makes it easy on me. I can just take them out when they're a little bit unhealthy. It's really easy and fast to start basil. They're cheap seeds, so don't worry about it if you need to remove one. They tend to take really well to transplanting. Then last, but definitely not least, actually most important, plant densely. Like whatever you are thinking right now, plant more densely than that. At least experiment with it. Again, remember that guidance that in certain seasons with enough sun in the right conditions, you can be planting 40 basil plants for every square meter. That's a lot of basil. Okay, finally, let's talk about a few things that I just don't worry about, that don't really seem to matter in terms of getting plenty of basil to actually eat. Okay, first off, I do not trellis my basil. Plenty of them are kind of floppy, but who cares? They still produce really nice, big, tasty leaves. I'm not at all worried about it. I wouldn't bother trellising your plants unless, I don't know, you want to spend the time doing so, in which case, go for it, have fun. 2, I wouldn't worry about having the perfect sun. These are literally, that's a zinnia, not a basil. These are literally growing in a mixture of native clay soil, a little bit of compost, and literal wood chips that I mixed in here. I had to fill up this giant 100-gallon container somehow, and I wasn't gonna do it by buying bagged topsoil, so I did it as cheap as I possibly could, and quite frankly, as long as they have plenty of nutrients, I give them a little bit of fertilizer, and then obviously there is some of that manure in here that I mentioned, and plenty of water. These plants seem to do pretty well. Again, they kind of grow like a weed if you let them and you just don't worry about it. Next up, try not to worry about it when the plant starts bolting. So I used to think that when my basil started to bolt that it was going to turn really bitter and unpleasant like a lot of other herbs do. You know, that all the leaves on the plant were going to suddenly become inedible as this plant started to flower. But the reality is, all you have to do is kind of get in there and occasionally pinch off these little flower buds or deadhead it, and that is going to keep the plant producing really nice, tasty leaves. It really doesn't seem to impact the flavor of the overall plant very much, and you can keep it growing for a long time and getting bushier and bushier and bushier over time. So yeah, just don't worry about it. Come out here every couple days and just prune off a little flower head and maybe gather or harvest some leaves while you're at it, and don't worry about it. So last up here, I really don't worry about pruning outside of harvesting, which is not really good advice, but it's practical advice. Basil really can benefit from a methodical pruning strategy. In fact, it benefits more than most other plants that we talk about pruning with. You can really grow a giant, monster, bushy basil plant if you start early and you are pruning according to a schedule and you're doing it the right way. The thing is that I have literally hundreds of other plants that don't grow as quickly as basil and that I really need to get in there and prune. And so I'm just not going to spend any significant amount of time coming out to my basil plant and pruning it outside of the time that I harvest. But when I do harvest, what I'm gonna do is just make sure that I'm coming to each one of these major branches and I am harvesting off above a leaf node, about a 1/4 inch above these little leaf nodes, and you'll see that there's 2 little sets of leaves coming off each side. And what that does is basically every time I'm coming out here to prune, I am encouraging that plant, if I don't have a reason to rip it out of the ground wholesale, and most of the time I don't, I'm encouraging that plant to just grow a little bit bushier instead. Yeah, so getting a little bit aggressive in here. So you can see you can really quickly come through, get a lot of basil. That one needs, wow, that one really needs a prune. And over here, get that one too, oh my goodness. So you can see in about 1 minute, I have not only harvested a whole lot of basil, especially if you add it to those other plants that I removed from the ground earlier, but I've also done a nice little prune job on this plant. And so in a few days to a week, what you're gonna start seeing is really all of these little leaf nodes right below the point where I pruned the plant, they're going to take off. And because I removed one stem and replaced it basically with two, I didn't really replace it, but I'm allowing these other two to get more sun, you're basically just getting compound interest on your effort. Those plants are going to get bigger and bigger and bushier over time, assuming they never hit a point where you want to remove them entirely. So yeah, I just go ahead and combine pruning and harvesting effort. Saves a little bit of time. That's basically it. I'm not gonna win any basil awards, and you know, I'm kind of okay with that. We get a lot of this plant, more than we need realistically out of a relatively small space, and I never really have to think about it. I don't have to put a lot of effort into it. I did say this was the lazy gardener's take, right? So hopefully this was helpful for you. If you did enjoy this video, or if you think maybe this is going to help you maybe not get more basil, but get the same amount of basil with less effort. Really, really appreciate it if you could give it a quick like. That definitely helps us out a lot. And otherwise, until next time, y'all, I hope I see you on the next one.